In the heart of a vibrant European city, where cobblestone streets met towering palaces, tourists from every corner of the globe gathered to witness one of the most iconic traditions, the changing of the guard. The palace courtyard buzzed with excitement as cameras clicked, children laughed, and visitors jostled for the best view. Among the crowd stood Jake, an American traveler who was loud, carefree, and always seeking attention. With his baseball cap tilted backward and a flashy t-shirt that clashed with the elegant surroundings, Jake stuck out like a sore thumb. Jake wasn't there for history or culture. He was there for likes. Every step he took was calculated to make his social media followers laugh or gasp. As the guards marched in perfect formation, their polished boots echoing against the stone pavement, Jake found himself amused by their stern expressions. To him, they looked robotic, stiff, silent, and humorless. How hard can it be to crack a smile? He muttered under his breath, chuckling at his own joke. The guards moved with precision, their bright red uniforms and bearskin hats making them look larger than life. They were symbols of tradition, discipline, and loyalty, but Jake only saw them as props for his entertainment. He began mimicking their movements, puffing out his chest and exaggerating their steps. At first, his antics drew giggles from nearby tourists. A group of teenagers pointed at him, laughing behind their hands, while a family snapped a picture of his performance. Encouraged by the reaction, Jake decided to take things further. He started shouting playful taunts, asking if the guards ever got tired of standing so still or if they practiced their serious faces in front of mirrors. When one guard turned slightly toward him, Jake waved dramatically, thinking he'd finally broken through the stoic facade. But the guard simply adjusted his position and resumed staring straight ahead, unfazed. This only fueled Jake's determination to get a reaction. As the ceremony continued, Jake grew bolder. He stepped closer to the guards, weaving between them as they marched, trying to disrupt their rhythm. Some tourists whispered nervously, unsure whether to intervene or stay quiet. Others rolled their eyes, annoyed by his antics. But no one said a word, assuming the guards were bound by strict rules not to engage with troublemakers. After all, these soldiers were trained professionals, right? What could possibly go wrong? Little did Jake realize, however, that he was about to cross a line he didn't even know existed. The guard nearest to him, a tall, imposing figure named Corporal James Whittaker, had silently endured Jake's mockery up to this point. Known for his unwavering composure, Whittaker had dealt with difficult situations before, but something about Jake's behavior felt different. It wasn't just playful teasing anymore. It was becoming outright disrespectful. Unaware of the storm brewing, Jake grinned mischievously. He thought he was untouchable, shielded by the assumption that the guards couldn't retaliate. But what he didn't know was that Whittaker had reached his limit. And when the moment came, Jake would learn just how wrong he was. Jake's antics grew bolder with each passing minute. The initial giggles from the crowd had turned into a mix of nervous laughter and uncomfortable silence. Some tourists shifted awkwardly, glancing at one another as if to ask, "Should we stop him?" But no one dared to speak up. After all, Jake seemed harmless enough. At least, that's what everyone wanted to believe. He began pacing back and forth in front of the guards, mimicking their stiff-legged march with exaggerated movements. His arms swung wildly, his face contorted into an over-the-top imitation of their serious expressions. A few kids in the crowd laughed, pointing at Jake like he was some kind of clown performing for their amusement. Even some adults couldn't help but chuckle nervously, though their laughter carried a hint of unease. They weren't sure whether this was entertaining or just plain disrespectful. One guard, in particular, caught Jake's attention, a towering figure with piercing eyes and an air of quiet authority. This was Corporal James Whittaker, whose reputation among his peers was built on discipline and restraint. Whittaker stood motionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as though nothing around him existed. To Jake, this stoic demeanor was irresistible. "Hey, buddy," he called out, waving his hands dramatically. You ever heard of smiling? It's free, you know. The comment drew scattered laughter from the crowd, but Whittaker didn't react. Not even a twitch. This only egged Jake on further. He stepped closer, practically nose to nose with the guard, and made a series of ridiculous faces, crossing his eyes, sticking out his tongue, puffing up his cheeks like a blowfish. "Come on, big guy," Jake teased, his voice loud enough to carry across the courtyard. "Just one little grin. For me." Still, Whittaker remained unmoved. His silence was deafening, almost unnerving. Jake, however, misinterpreted it as permission to keep going. Emboldened by the lack of response, he started blocking Whittaker's path during the ceremonial march, forcing the guard to adjust his steps slightly to maintain formation. The disruption caused a ripple effect among the other guards, who had to compensate for the change in rhythm. Tourists exchanged worried glances, sensing that things were escalating too quickly. "Wow, you're really good at standing there," Jake quipped sarcastically, earning more nervous laughs from the onlookers. He pulled out his phone, turning the camera toward himself. "Hey, guys, check this out. I'm about to make history here." With a smirk, he began narrating his actions as though he were hosting a live stream. "This is me, hanging out with the royal guards. Look at these guys. They don't even blink. How do they sleep at night without moving?" By now, the atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted. What had started as lighthearted teasing was morphing into something darker. Some tourists whispered anxiously, wondering how far Jake would push the situation. Others looked away, unwilling to watch what might happen next. Even the children who had laughed earlier seemed confused, sensing the tension in the air. Whittaker, meanwhile, remained a statue of calm. His jaw tightened imperceptibly, but otherwise, he gave no sign of irritation. To the untrained eye, he appeared as composed as ever. Yet those who knew him well could see the faintest flicker of frustration behind his steely gaze. Jake, oblivious to the subtle warning signs, continued his performance, completely unaware that he was playing with fire. As the moments dragged on, Jake decided to take one final step, a move that would shatter the fragile balance between humor and hostility. Little did he realize, his next action would not only test Whittaker's patience, but also reveal the true extent of the guard's authority. The tension in the courtyard was palpable, hanging thick in the air like a storm waiting to break. And when it finally did, no one, not even Jake, was prepared for what came next. Jake's confidence had reached an all-time high. The crowd's mixed reactions, nervous laughter, hushed whispers, and even a few cheers, only fueled his desire to push the envelope further. He thrived on attention, and right now, every eye in the courtyard was on him. But Jake failed to notice the growing unease among the spectators. Some parents ushered their children away, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control. Others stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. Still recording himself with his phone, Jake turned back to Corporal Whittaker, who remained as immovable as ever. "All right, big guy," Jake said with a smirk, holding the camera steady. "Let's see if you can handle this." Without hesitation, he raised his hand and flipped off the guard. A crude, unmistakable gesture meant to provoke a reaction. His grin widened as he held the pose, waiting for Whittaker to flinch, glare, or show any sign of emotion at all. But Whittaker didn't move. For a brief moment, there was complete silence. Even the distant chatter of tourists seemed to fade into the background. It was as though time itself had stopped. The only sound came from Jake's heavy breathing and the faint rustle of the guards' uniforms in the breeze. The crowd collectively held its breath, unsure of what would happen next. Then something shifted. Jake saw it first, a flicker in Whittaker's eyes. The guard's posture, once relaxed yet rigid, tensed ever so slightly. His gloved hands, which had been resting perfectly still at his sides, curled into fists. To anyone else, these changes might have gone unnoticed, but Jake felt it too. The sudden, unspoken tension crackling in the air between them. For the first time since he'd started his antics, Jake felt a twinge of doubt creep into his mind. Was he going too far? Before he could process the thought, Whittaker moved. And he moved fast. In one swift, decisive motion, Whittaker stepped forward, closing the gap between them in an instant. Before Jake could react, the guard grabbed him firmly by the collar of his shirt, yanking him backward. The force of the movement knocked the phone from Jake's hand, sending it clattering to the ground. Gasps erupted from the crowd as Whittaker pinned Jake against the iron railing of the palace courtyard, his grip unyielding. "You think this is funny?" Whittaker growled, his voice low and sharp, cutting through the stunned silence like a knife. "This isn't a game. Show some respect, or I'll make sure you regret it." Jake's bravado vanished in an instant. His face paled, his knees wobbled, and his usual cocky demeanor crumbled under the weight of Whittaker's authority. He stammered, trying to form words, but nothing coherent came out. The man who had spent the last 10 minutes mocking the guards was now rendered utterly speechless. The crowd froze, cameras still rolling but capturing a very different scene than they had expected. No one dared to speak or step forward. Even the other guards paused mid-step, their disciplined routine momentarily disrupted by the unexpected confrontation. The once lighthearted atmosphere had transformed into something tense and surreal. For Jake, the realization hit hard. He had underestimated the situation. And the man standing before him. What had started as harmless teasing had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. As Whittaker's piercing gaze bore into him, Jake understood that he wasn't dealing with just another passive figure in a uniform. This was someone who commanded respect, and wouldn't hesitate to demand it. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to feel sympathy for Jake or admiration for Whittaker. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. This moment would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. The courtyard was eerily quiet, save for the sound of Jake's ragged breathing and the faint rustle of Whittaker's uniform as he held the tourist firmly against the railing. Every eye in the crowd was glued to the scene unfolding before them, their expressions a mix of shock, disbelief, and awe. Some tourists instinctively stepped back, creating a wider circle around the two men, while others stood frozen, cameras still trained on the confrontation. Jake's bravado had completely evaporated. Gone was the smirking, loud-mouthed traveler who had spent the last several minutes mocking the guards. In his place stood a trembling man, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. I didn't mean anything by it," Jake stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was just a joke." Whittaker's grip didn't loosen. His steely gaze never wavered as he leaned in slightly, his voice low but carrying enough authority to silence any lingering murmurs from the crowd. "A joke," he repeated, his tone sharp and unyielding. "You think disrespecting this uniform, and everything it represents, is a joke?" The question hung heavy in the air, leaving Jake speechless. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of what he'd done. This wasn't just about annoying the guard. It was about undermining centuries of tradition, discipline, and service. The weight of that realization hit him like a freight train, and his shoulders slumped under its force. Before Whittaker could say or do anything further, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "Corporal Whittaker." It belonged to a senior officer who had been alerted by the commotion. He strode toward them with purpose, his polished boots clicking against the stone pavement. His expression was stern, but there was also a flicker of understanding in his eyes as he took in the situation. Reluctantly, Whittaker released his grip on Jake's collar, stepping back into his usual rigid stance. Though his physical hold on Jake was gone, his piercing glare remained fixed on the shaken tourist. Jake stumbled backward, clutching at his shirt, as if to steady himself. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The senior officer turned to Whittaker, speaking in a firm but measured tone. "Stand down, Corporal. We'll handle this according to protocol." Whittaker gave a curt nod, though his jaw remained clenched. It was clear that he hadn't acted out of anger, but out of a deep sense of duty, and perhaps frustration at seeing his role disrespected so blatantly. Meanwhile, Jake tried to compose himself, muttering an apology that sounded more like a plea. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I'll leave, okay? Just let me go." But the damage had already been done. Two security personnel quickly moved in, flanking Jake and guiding him away from the palace grounds. One of them stooped to pick up Jake's phone, which had fallen during the altercation, ensuring it wouldn't be used to document or incriminate any further. As Jake was escorted away, the crowd began to murmur again, breaking the tense silence. Some people applauded softly, clearly approving of Whittaker's actions. Others shook their heads, muttering about how Jake had brought this upon himself. A few even debated whether the response had been too harsh, though most agreed that Jake had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. For Whittaker, the incident was far from over. As the senior officer led him aside for a private discussion, it was evident that questions would arise about his decision to intervene so directly. Still, Whittaker showed no signs of regret. To him, this wasn't about personal pride or vengeance. It was about protecting the integrity of his position and the institution he represented. Back in the courtyard, the ceremony resumed, though the mood had shifted noticeably. The guards continued their march with the same precision as before, but the atmosphere felt heavier, charged with a newfound respect for the men in red uniforms. Tourists watched quietly now, their earlier excitement replaced by a sense of reverence. And as Jake disappeared from view, escorted firmly by security, the crowd couldn't help but reflect on what they'd witnessed. What had started as a lighthearted spectacle had turned into a powerful reminder of boundaries, respect, and consequences. No one would soon forget the moment when a brash tourist learned just how seriously these royal guards took their roles, and how far they were willing to go to defend them. Jake's humiliation didn't end at the palace gates. As he was led away by security personnel, his face burned with shame, and every step felt heavier than the last. The once confident traveler who had strutted into the courtyard just minutes earlier now shuffled along like a scolded child. His phone, his prized tool for capturing attention and gaining online fame, was confiscated, leaving him feeling even more powerless. At the nearby police station, things only got worse. Jake was ushered into a small, sterile room where officers reviewed the video footage captured during the incident. The clips painted a damning picture: Jake mocking the guards, disrupting their march, and ultimately flipping off Corporal Whittaker in full view of dozens of tourists. There was no denying what he'd done. The charges came swiftly: public disorder, disrespecting a member of the Royal Guard, an offense taken extremely seriously in this country, and disturbing a ceremonial event were among the violations listed against him. Jake tried to explain himself, stammering through weak excuses about cultural differences and claiming he didn't know how serious his actions were. But the officers weren't swayed. They had seen countless cases like this before, where overconfident visitors ignored local customs and traditions, thinking they were above the rules. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, videos of Jake's antics and Whittaker's harsh response were circulating on social media platforms around the world. Hashtags like #RespectTheGuard and #RoyalGuardReaction began trending as people weighed in on the confrontation. Some defended Jake, arguing that the guards' reaction had been too extreme, while others praised Whittaker for standing up to someone who clearly disrespected his role. For Jake, the backlash was overwhelming. His social media accounts, which he had carefully curated to showcase his adventurous lifestyle, were flooded with comments. At first, there were jokes and memes mocking his downfall, but soon the tone turned harsher. Followers accused him of being arrogant, selfish, and culturally insensitive. Sponsorships and partnerships he relied on for income began pulling out one by one, citing concerns about associating with someone embroiled in such controversy. But it wasn't just his online presence that suffered. Authorities banned Jake from returning to the country, labeling him as a troublemaker unfit to visit again. He was fined heavily, an amount that wiped out most of his savings. When he finally boarded a flight back home, he did so quietly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The man who thrived on attention couldn't bear to meet the curious stares of fellow passengers. Meanwhile, the story took on a life of its own. News outlets picked up the tale, interviewing witnesses and experts about the cultural significance of the Royal Guards and the importance of respecting local traditions. Many praised Whittaker for maintaining discipline under pressure, noting that his actions likely prevented further escalation. Others debated whether the rules governing the guards should allow for more flexibility in handling disruptive individuals. Back at the palace, life returned to normal, or as close to normal as possible after such an unusual event. The guards resumed their duties, marching with the same precision and dignity that had earned them admiration for generations. Yet whispers of the incident lingered among staff and visitors alike. For many, it served as a reminder of the delicate balance between tradition and modernity, authority and freedom. As for Jake, the consequences of his actions followed him long after he left the country. Friends distanced themselves, embarrassed by his behavior, while family members struggled to understand why he hadn't shown more restraint. What had started as a harmless attempt to entertain his followers had spiraled into a public relations disaster, damaging not only his reputation, but also his sense of self-worth. By the time Jake stepped off the plane in his hometown, he was a changed man, or at least he was beginning to realize he needed to change. The brash confidence that once defined him was replaced by a deep sense of regret. For the first time in his life, Jake understood that actions have consequences, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. And while he couldn't undo what had happened, he knew one thing for certain. He would never look at a uniform or underestimate the power of respect. The same way again. Months had passed since the infamous incident at the palace, but Jake still couldn't shake it from his mind. Back in his small apartment, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and scattered travel brochures, he found himself staring blankly at old photos of happier times. Each image, a sunset over a foreign city, a spontaneous group shot with locals, or a candid moment from one of his adventures, felt like a relic from a life he barely recognized anymore. The vibrant, carefree traveler in those pictures seemed like someone else entirely. The memory of that day haunted him, not just because of the punishment he faced, but because of the shame he felt when he thought about how he'd acted. For the first time in his life, Jake wasn't laughing at himself. He was genuinely embarrassed. He replayed the scene over and over in his head. The mocking gestures, the crude joke, and finally, Corporal Whittaker's unyielding response. It wasn't the physical confrontation that stung the most. It was realizing that he'd disrespected something far greater than just a man in uniform. He'd insulted centuries of tradition, discipline, and sacrifice without even understanding their significance. Determined to make amends, Jake began researching ways to give back to communities he'd once dismissed. His search led him to a local veterans organization dedicated to supporting former service members struggling with PTSD and reintegration into civilian life. Though hesitant at first, Jake reached out, offering his time and energy to help however he could. To his surprise, they welcomed him warmly, assigning him simple tasks like organizing events, running errands, and assisting with outreach programs. At first, Jake didn't know what to expect. Many of the veterans were older, battle-worn individuals who carried themselves with quiet dignity. They weren't interested in hearing excuses or apologies. They wanted action. So Jake worked hard, showing up early and staying late, determined to prove himself. Slowly but surely, he began to earn their trust. Conversations started flowing more naturally, and Jake listened intently as they shared stories of their time in service, the sacrifices they'd made, the challenges they'd faced, and the pride they felt in wearing their uniforms. Through these interactions, Jake gained a newfound appreciation for the men and women who served their countries. He realized that being part of something bigger than yourself required not just courage, but also humility and respect. These lessons hit close to home, forcing him to confront his own behavior and the ripple effects it had caused. Eventually, Jake decided to take one final step toward redemption. Sitting down at his cluttered desk one evening, he penned a heartfelt letter addressed to Corporal James Whittaker. In it, he admitted his mistakes, acknowledging how disrespectful and selfish he'd been. "I never meant to undermine your role or dishonor the traditions you uphold," he wrote. "What I did was wrong, and I deeply regret it." He thanked Whittaker for teaching him a lesson he desperately needed to learn, expressing gratitude for the guard's restraint despite the provocation. Jake mailed the letter without expecting a reply. Whether Whittaker read it or tossed it aside didn't matter to him. Writing it brought a small sense of closure, allowing Jake to release some of the guilt that had weighed on him for months. More importantly, it marked the beginning of a personal transformation, one that went beyond public apologies or social media posts. As weeks turned into months, Jake continued volunteering, pouring his energy into helping others rather than seeking attention for himself. His social media presence shifted too. Gone were the flashy selfies and staged pranks. Instead, he posted thoughtful reflections on his experiences working with veterans and learning about different cultures. Followers who had once mocked him now praised his efforts, calling him an inspiration for turning his lowest moment into an opportunity for growth. Though Jake couldn't undo the past, he was determined to build a better future, not just for himself, but for those around him. The brash, self-centered traveler was gone, replaced by a more grounded individual who understood the value of humility, empathy, and respect. And while he knew he'd always carried the scars of that fateful day at the palace, they no longer defined him. Instead, they reminded him of how far he'd come and how much farther he still wanted to go. Years rolled by, and Jake wasn't the same person he used to be. The man who once thrived on chaos and attention had transformed into someone thoughtful, reflective, and deeply aware of his impact on others. His travels continued, but they no longer revolved around chasing likes or staging outrageous stunts for social media. Instead, Jake approached each new destination with a sense of purpose, immersing himself in local traditions, listening to people's stories, and seeking ways to give back. He began documenting his journeys differently too. Gone were the flashy captions and over-the-top performances meant to entertain. In their place were heartfelt posts about cultural lessons he'd learned, moments that humbled him, and connections he'd made along the way. One photo showed him sitting cross-legged on a dirt floor, laughing with a group of children in a remote village. Another captured him helping rebuild a community center after a natural disaster. Each image told a story, not just of Jake, but of the places and people who had shaped him. Jake's online following grew again, though this time it felt different. His audience wasn't there for cheap laughs or shock value. They were drawn to his authenticity and willingness to share meaningful experiences. Many commented on how inspiring his journey of growth had been, saying things like, "You've reminded me that we can all learn from our mistakes," or "Your change is proof that people can grow." Back home, Jake became known as an advocate for cultural sensitivity and mutual respect. He gave talks at schools and community centers, sharing his story not to glorify his past behavior, but to emphasize the importance of understanding and appreciating differences. "I used to think I was untouchable," he would say, standing before a room full of curious listeners. "But one moment of arrogance taught me that actions have consequences, and that ignorance isn't an excuse." As for Corporal James Whittaker, Jake never heard directly from him. Whether the letter reached him or ended up unread remained a mystery. But Jake chose to believe that Whittaker might have appreciated the gesture, even if silently. Occasionally, Jake would scroll through old news articles about the incident, marveling at how much his perspective had shifted since then. What had once seemed like an embarrassing defeat now felt like a turning point, a moment when life forced him to confront who he truly was and decide who he wanted to become. Whittaker, meanwhile, returned to his duties at the palace, quietly resuming his role as a symbol of discipline and tradition. To outsiders, nothing appeared changed. He stood tall, marched with precision, and maintained the same stoic expression he'd worn for years. Yet those closest to him noticed subtle signs of reflection. Fellow guards occasionally joked about the tourist incident, teasing Whittaker good-naturedly about his rare moment of assertiveness. But Whittaker didn't mind. If anything, he saw it as a reminder of why his job mattered, not just for show, but for preserving something larger than himself. The story of Jake and Whittaker eventually faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals and viral moments. But its legacy lived on in quieter ways. Tour guides began using the incident as a cautionary tale during palace visits, urging visitors to respect the guards and appreciate the history behind their roles. Parents shared the story with their children as a lesson about boundaries and consequences, and travelers everywhere started thinking twice before crossing lines they didn't fully understand. For Jake, the experience became a cornerstone of his identity. It wasn't something he ran from anymore. It was something he carried with pride, not because he liked what he'd done, but because of how far he'd come since then. He often thought about Whittaker, wondering what the guard might think if he could see him now. Would he approve? Would he acknowledge the effort Jake had put into changing? Jake hoped so, though he knew he might never find out. And so, the two men, one a former troublemaker turned advocate, the other a steadfast guardian of tradition, remained forever linked by a single day that neither would forget. Their encounter served as a powerful reminder of humanity's capacity for both missteps and redemption, teaching everyone involved that respect isn't given lightly. It's earned through understanding, humility, and sometimes hard lessons. The story of Jake and Corporal Whittaker became more than just a fleeting moment of drama. It evolved into a timeless lesson about respect, humility, and the power of second chances. For those who had followed the incident closely, it was impossible not to reflect on its deeper meaning. What started as an act of arrogance and provocation ended as a tale of personal growth and transformation, proving that even the most unlikely individuals can change when faced with accountability. Jake's journey wasn't easy, but it was undeniably rewarding. Over time, he discovered joy in connecting with people rather than seeking validation through attention. Whether volunteering at veterans events, mentoring young travelers, or simply striking up conversations with locals during his trips, Jake found fulfillment in actions that mattered. His social media presence transformed into a platform for positivity, inspiring others to approach life with curiosity and kindness. Followers often commented on how relatable his struggles were, saying things like, "Your honesty makes me want to be better," or "Thank you for showing us that mistakes don't define us." Meanwhile, back at the palace, life continued much as it always had. The guards marched in perfect formation, their stoic expressions unchanged, yet their presence carried a renewed sense of reverence among visitors. Tourists now approached the ceremony with greater respect, mindful of the boundaries and traditions they once might have taken lightly. Guides shared stories of the infamous tourist who flipped off a guard, using it as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of why the guards deserved admiration, not just for their discipline, but for representing centuries of history and service. Corporal James Whittaker remained a quiet figure within this legacy. Though he rarely spoke about the incident publicly, his colleagues often credited him with setting an example of professionalism under pressure. Some joked that his reaction had become legendary, while others noted how it reinforced the importance of standing firm in the face of disrespect. Whittaker himself never sought recognition. He simply returned to his duties, content knowing that his actions had reminded countless people of the value of honor and decorum. Years later, Jake decided to revisit the city where it all began. This time, however, he came not as a brash traveler seeking thrills, but as someone eager to pay tribute to the place and the people that had changed his life forever. Standing outside the palace gates, he watched the changing of the guard ceremony with a mix of awe and gratitude. The red uniforms, the rhythmic marching, and the solemn expressions no longer seemed robotic or distant. They symbolized dedication, sacrifice, and unity. As the ceremony concluded, Jake lingered behind, hesitant but hopeful. He spotted Corporal Whittaker among the retreating guards and mustered the courage to approach him. "Excuse me, sir," Jake said softly, extending a hand. "I'm Jake. I doubt you remember me, but I wanted to thank you for everything." Whittaker paused, studying Jake's face for a long moment before shaking his hand firmly. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The brief connection said enough. Acknowledgement, forgiveness, and mutual respect passed between them silently. Walking away from the palace that day, Jake felt lighter, as though a final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The man who once mocked tradition now stood as one of its greatest advocates. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, Jake knew he was ready to face them with humility and grace. In the end, the story of Jake and Whittaker wasn't just about conflict. It was about redemption, understanding, and the quiet strength of humanity. It reminded everyone involved that even in moments of tension and misunderstanding, there is always room for growth, learning, and reconciliation. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn, one small step at a time.